To welcome everybody back. So on behalf of the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies and the Labor Solidarity Project here at the University of Washington-Tacoma, I'd like to welcome everyone back to our fall seminar series, Organizing for Change. I'm your host, Alex Miller. I'm an associate teaching professor here at UW-T, where I teach labor studies, American studies, and literature. And we got another great event coming your way this evening. We're going to be learning about the past, the present, and the potential futures of LGBTQ advocacy within the U.S. labor movement. And this, like most good histories, is it's a complicated history that expands beyond the experience of marginalized workers, and I think points toward the cultural and the political mechanics that undergird many of the seismic shifts we've experienced in recent American history. This is a topic that concerns the kind of evolving and dynamic relationship between, corporations, states, and of course, down here on Earth, us little workers, right? So it's, as we discussed last week, it can be a frustrating time to be a worker in America, but I think like a lot of frustrating times before this moment, right? It can be can also be a radicalizing time. And I think you see this sort of spirit of radicalization in the recent surge in labor activism. And I think we see it too in the way that labor and concepts related to labor, like solidarity, have re-entered back into the zeitgeist. But I will say too, it's also a very confusing time. It's a time when many of us are increasingly seeing ourselves as fighting an uphill battle materially, just kind of earning enough to make it to the next month. And this is, of course, occurring during an era of social and cultural progress, right? Some of which is real and some of which is very superficial and thin. It's an era, and we'll hear more about this evening, where corporations like our very own Starbucks, right, are kind of simultaneously wrapping itself in the pride flag while also denying LGBTQ baristas the union protections that they need to live with dignity, right? So it's reconciling those two things and the contradictions is challenging. So I would say that if you're confused, don't feel alone. I'm right there with you. You've come to the right place. And you're at the right place at the right time, because I think joining us tonight to help lend some clarity to these confusing times is our guest, Dr. Joanna Wuest, who's an assistant professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Stony Brook University and a public fellow in LGBTQ rights at the Public Religion Research Institute. She's the author of Born This Way: Science, Citizenship, and Inequality in the American LGBTQ Movement, which was published just last year. She's also the author of many articles that appear in many different outlets, which is kind of always exciting. So her more kind of popularized writing on LGBTQ rights, health, and the conservative legal movements has appeared in The Nation, Boston Review, Psyche, and Dissent. I actually just encountered Joanna's work earlier this year for the first time in New Labor Forum, where she wrote an article on unions and LGBTQ rights that had me immediately updating my syllabus, but also cold calling Joanna and inviting her to the seminar. So I want to thank you, Joanna, for your work. I want to thank you for responding to what was probably a random email. And of course, most importantly, thank you for joining us here this evening. I'm just really excited to share your work with our campus and the larger community. And really excited about the expertise that you bring to this topic. So what we're going to do, we'll stick to the usual schedule, where we'll have sort of a presentation followed by some Q&A. I had students submit questions ahead of time, and they were fabulous. So we'll kind of work through some of those. But then if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to jot them down in the chat board, and we'll cycle through those. And I think that just about takes care of everything, with the exception of joining me in giving Joanna a warm digital welcome from the LSB.
So yeah, thank you so much again. The lovely introduction, and I'm just so incredibly happy to be here for academic reasons and non-academic reasons. Just by way of a little more intro, years ago, I was a member of this thing called the Graduates Employees Together at the University of Pennsylvania, or we called ourselves Get Up. And that was the second attempt at unionizing grad student workers at the University of Pennsylvania. And we weren't successful for some political reasons. The Trump administration came in and blocked the unions basically weren't going to submit elections once the NLRB turned over in terms of its partisan makeup. And that'll be something that we'll talk about kind of at the end of my conversation here and maybe later tonight. But the third time was the charm for them, and they just won their election last May. So it's wonderful to have good news to share on the labor front. And then so in my academic work, I also study a range of things, as Alex said, law, political economy, sexual and gender minority rights and health. And kind of relevant for tonight, I've been really interested lately in just how queer workers fit into both labor struggles for equality and democratic power, as well as capital's uneven efforts to dress themselves up, again, as Alex said, as the true champion of queer rights. And we can talk about just how little that sort of dressing actually means at the end of the day. But I am so curious about why, even in those kind of more fleeting instances, Starbucks kind of drapes itself in a trans flag, for instance. And so I want to kind of begin tonight here with a story about when I was just an observer. I was doing kind of research and just learning at the time at a LGBTQ rights kind of national activist conference. And there I encountered this story about these queer, low-income, primarily people of color, these workers who were working at a few airport Starbucks locations along with Unite Here. And shortly after, I kind of listened to them at that conference explain their kind of struggle for not just kind of recognition of kind of just simple things like someone using the correct pronouns, for instance, but also being able to afford to live in their cities with the kind of wages and particularly the scheduling hours that they were able to get. Some places have fair work weeks where you can know your schedule in advance, you get enough kind of hours, but they had none of these protections. And so this was a labor union trying to kind of forefront the experiences of these Starbucks workers, both in terms of their kind of struggles as being queer workers, but just as workers. And so we know that it wasn't Unite Here's campaign that would take off, but we now know we've seen Starbucks Workers United itself, this very kind of queer-oriented union in a few different ways, has secured election victories at over, and I think my data might even be not updated, but I have 350 cafes at least have been organized. And those campaigns too, we've seen a fight for kind of basic protections and fair wages on the job, but also against Starbucks's kind of capitulation to pressures such as in 2023, they took down in-store pride decorations. And so there was a kind of Starbucks Workers United-led campaign to kind of recommit in the face of a time when it was hard to commit to trans rights. We've also seen other more established unions like the UAW and the AFT have created LGBTQ plus caucuses as of late. And others, like the United Steelworkers, have ensured that trans workers and their families have access to gender-affirming care as kind of part of their healthcare plans. And so one question I had in kind of looking at all of this a while ago was, why is this all happening right now? Or more simply, kind of, what is the queer appeal of unions? And the most important answer there is probably a deceptively simple one, and that is queer workers are like other workers in that their life chances and comforts depend on the basic kind of material needs and comforts that unions routinely provide to their members. But moreover, queer people and trans people especially have some other kinds of challenges. We know from kind of data from the Williams Institute at UCLA, we know that queer people and especially trans people are more likely to live below the poverty line than their straight peers in a country. And again, already where high rates of kind of debt, inadequate health insurance, and at-will employment are already very kind of widespread. Unions also provide kind of significant anti-discrimination protections to sexual and gender minorities in the workplace, which may lead us to ask the very reasonable question, why are unions necessary if we already have civil rights law? Well, for one, we have civil rights law, and for instance, the Civil Rights Act at the national level protects against discrimination from your employer discriminating against you on the basis of your sex, for instance, and we've had that codified in national law since the 1970s. And it was only just a few years ago in 2020, in this case called Bostock v. Clayton County, that we saw the Supreme Court expand the protections that were in Title VII, specifically of the Civil Rights Act at the national level, to include things like sexual orientation and gender identity. So those things were read into that just one, three-letter word, sex, to expand rights that Congress so far has been unwilling to expand and codify into statutory law. But the problem with that is that actually Title VII protections were before Bostock and have been for quite some time already pretty paltry. And that is, it's extremely difficult to win a Title VII employment discrimination case, or at least the kind of deck is stacked against the worker in that situation. The law was already written more narrowly than some advocates at the time wanted it to be. If we think about anti-discrimination, that's a really narrow legal kind of protection. We had labor feminists in the 1960s and 1970s pushing for way more than just that sort of negative right against protections against discrimination. There's nothing that balances out unequal kind of distribution of work in the sort of domestic space, for instance. There's all sorts of things that are not included in that very narrow legal authority of Title VII. And it's also just very difficult to prove in court that you have been fired, for instance, or otherwise discriminated against by your employer. And so labor unions can provide far more kind of protections than we see in existing civil rights law by basis of the contract, right? You can have anti-discrimination provisions written into your union contract. We also have, if we're thinking about going the Supreme Court route, Bostock is kind of an outlier, right? And it's an outlier both on labor rights, and it's an outlier on sexual and gender minority rights. And that is, the Supreme Court has consistently, in the last few years, ruled against queer rights. It is increasingly easier for a social service agency that contracts and takes money from the state to, if it's a religious organization, they can actually deny queer couples the ability to become a foster or adoptive parent. That is protected under the sort of free exercise of religion, the Supreme Court has said. We have similar things involving Christian wedding website makers. And then also on the labor front, we see cases like the 2018 case Janus, where the public sector is basically made to be right to work, and workers have far fewer kind of avenues to gain real kind of class power by virtue of decisions that the Supreme Court has handed down. And so although the labor movement's attention to LGBTQ issues may seem somewhat like a contemporary phenomenon, such integration extends back to the early 20th century. And so the late historian Alan Berube actually traversed North America teaching activists at the time, several decades ago, about the Marine Cooks and Stewards Union, which was, by its existence in the early 1930s, already a few things. It was increasingly racially desegregated, something kind of very cutting edge for the time. and it had a gay-friendly culture. And this is something that had been kind of written out of the kind of history of gay and lesbian history and labor history as well. And then we saw as gay and lesbian civil rights movement organizations took shape in the 60s and 70s, independent queer labor organizations and caucuses within existing union locals began to form. But again, they were forming, but not without a struggle. And that is, we see groups like the independent New York-based Gay Teachers Association, for example. During the 70s, they spent several years pressuring the United Federation of Teachers, the larger teachers union, to simply advertise their existence to their membership. But eventually they did, and they became increasingly incorporated into the broader teachers union movement. By the 1980s, we're seeing many more workers gain rights as members of unions, but also as gay and lesbian members of unions. We see workers in publishing, among them employees at the Village Voice in New York, as well as workers in government, food services, retail, and education again. They began organizing these caucuses within their local unions and fighting very successfully for a range of things, like anti-discrimination protections, again, more robust than your sort of ones afforded by the national government, and at that time, not at all afforded to gays and lesbians. They included HIV/AIDS education trainings, were very important at the time, a push for employers to do that. And then also to provide domestic partner benefits, which was huge in general, but also in the HIV/AIDS crisis, where if you're married to someone and they have health insurance, they can't share it with you. Or you live with someone, rather, you're not married, they can't share that health insurance with you. But these kind of early protections enabled domestic partnerships to share things like healthcare benefits. And then we see recognizing the growing importance of queer workers' needs within the labor movement. The AFL-CIO created Pride at Work in 1998, which now functions alongside other AFL-CIO constituency groups, including the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, for instance. And so for decades, queer sympathetic workers and organizations, oftentimes working in these sorts of unions and local caucuses, queer caucuses, they've thwarted groups like the religious rights, dual assault on minority rights and labor power. And I say dual because too often the religious right is portrayed as a somewhat kind of purely cultural movement, one focused on defending traditional values against secularism is maybe a common way we would define the religious right. But in fact, the religious right was orchestrated by those like Christian political strategist Paul Weyrich and many massively kind of enriched industrial leaders in oil, in alcohol, in aluminum manufacturing. So the sort of conservative Christian ideals are there driving a lot of the politics, but it's the money, and it's the money that was kind of brought in by these industrial leaders that was so crucial to the religious rights kind of power. And this coalition aimed to convince Christian blue-collar voters, among others, that the Democratic Party's New Deal and their Great Society, social and economic reforms, had undermined so-called traditional conceptions of morality and liberty. So they get folks like the moral majority's Jerry Falwell to come out, and they tell him, and he does say things like, actually, OSHA protections for workers on the job is affront to Christian liberty. And so they're really tying in together that anti-government message with their sort of traditional values message. And so when the religious right is taking shape, they're searching for sorts of targets and particularly kind of scapegoats that they can blame a lot of these kind of Democratic Party transformations to the welfare state and labor rights on. And they settled in part on gay and lesbians, especially as the movement had just begun to kind of take shape and had begun to change some, especially municipal law, to kind of codify some early protections for civil rights. And that sort of visibility and those early victories made queer people visible enough that the religious right could say, this is a sign of cultural decay. They also targeted desegregation policies and abortion rights, but gays and lesbians were a very kind of early target as well. And for instance, we see in 1977, a very ominously named Save Our Children Incorporated. And that might have some resonance with kind of politics today. Well, Save Our Children succeeded in overturning a Miami-Dade County anti-discrimination ordinance, thus kind of inaugurating this religious right anti-queer crusade. So again, then where do unions fit into all of this kind of budding religious right politics? Well, we see, for instance, in 1978 in California, this state senator named John Briggs introduced this Briggs Initiative, as it was come to be known, this ballot sort of referendum that all the voters in California would vote on. And he proposed that public schools should be able to fire all of their gay and lesbian teachers. And John Briggs is an interesting guy. He's kind of a Reaganite before Reagan becomes a national phenomenon. He is an incredible enemy of government regulation in California. He's opposing kind of early environmental regulations that are being passed in California. And he's also an enemy of labor rights. And so we can see here again that religious right connection, why he's demonizing gay and lesbian school teachers in pursuit of some very kind of broader goals in the state. And so the Briggs Initiative really kind of spurred, it was a catalyst for gay and lesbian workers to move to action. And they formed groups like the Workers' Conference to Defeat the Briggs Initiative. We can see here this issue of Radical America magazine covered some of these developments at the time. And that Conference to Defeat the Briggs Initiative brought together rank and file members of the AFT in California, so teachers, as well as the United Auto Workers, the United Steel Workers, the Teamsters, the Culinary Workers Unions. I'm going to run out of breath before I finish the list of this. The American Postal Workers Union. It's a very kind of broad coalition of rank and file members of these organizations, as well as regional labor groups. California's AFL-CIO Council joined the San Francisco Labor Council and the California Teachers Association. They kind of all joined this fight against the Briggs Initiative. And if we think about it, why they did so is because they all knew who John Briggs was. They knew what his broader aims were, and they were fighting him in many other arenas as well. And they could kind of see that this was an attack not just on queer rights itself, something that was maybe a little bit less legible to many folks in the labor movement at that time, but it was an attack on a particular group of public sector workers who were also represented in some of these other unions. And so here we see that kind of injury to one is an injury to all mentality that kind of spurred the labor movement at a very kind of early period, 2 decades before Pride at Work was ever formed, to protect gay and lesbian teachers in California. Similarly, if we look to the 1990s, unions made a similar difference in defeating conservative groups' efforts to codify sorts of discriminatory laws against queer people. And so in the 1990s, we see in Pacific Northwest states like Washington, like Oregon, as well as ones a little further south like Colorado, we see these lumber towns in some of these states and during really harsh economic conditions. Some of these lumber yards are closing. They're kind of the lifeblood of the economy. At the same time, we're seeing wealthy transplants from the coast move into some of these communities. And it becomes kind of this very kind of conflict that's this development rather that's rooted in an economic reality that is disappearing jobs and livelihoods, becomes very easily kind of redirected at these wealthy transplants. Some of them who are assumed to be kind of bringing in new lifestyles, as well as gay and lesbian identities into these small towns, which only thought that they had no kind of history of kind of interaction with queer people. In fact, as we see in books like Arlene Stein's kind of account of this called The Stranger Next Door, we can see that actually there always were somewhat visible even gay and lesbian folks who are living in these old lumber towns. But that didn't stop the sort of wealthy transplants to the area being sort of seen as that is what it means to be gay. What it means to be gay is to be a rootless, wealthy cosmopolitan, right? And the right really seizes on that, and they pass things, or they put things on constitutional kind of ballot referendums. And there's these attempts to preempt local anti-discrimination ordinances. And so that is, you would get your ballot and it would say whether or not you thought that the state constitution should be amended this election season to make it so no city in your state is allowed to protect the rights of gays and lesbians. And it was kind of passed on this idea of that these were wealthy queer people trying to exercise special rights in these cities where they are able to codify these protections. And we see in these instances, union density played a significant role in voter outcomes in those referendums. So in Right to Work Colorado, we see progressive groups did not prevail in stopping the Constitution from being amended in this very anti-queer way. But in Oregon, workers led by the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, Local 503, they contributed to the defeat of a 1992 initiative. And so, as we can see in work, and I need to plug those, especially like Miriam Frank out in the Union tells the story in a really kind of detailed way. We can see some similar stories told in this collection Out at Work. Some of whom who were in that volume work today at New Labor Forum, where the print version of my talk tonight was originally published. So if you want more of these stories of kind of unions fighting against the right, for instance, these are some excellent places to check that out. So we see organized labor continues to play a crucial role in combating state-level assaults on LGBTQ rights. So just again, as John Briggs in California forged a very anti-labor agenda with a ban on queer public school teachers, we see those like Republican Florida Governor Ron DeSantis demonize queer and queer-friendly public school teachers and counselors, for instance, while fundamentally undermining the state's public sector unions. And what do I mean by that? So in the national media in the last few years, Ron DeSantis is known for a few things. I think maybe almost most famously, he's known for Don't Say Gay and other sorts of attacks on queer people in education, as well as the very kind of curriculum of what is taught. Can queer history, as well as other kind of minority groups' histories, be told in Florida? And so this is the kind of major kind of visible piece of legislation and type of attack that Ron DeSantis and the Florida Republican Party is kind of getting behind in the last few years. But at the same time, they're doing things like passing a Paycheck Protection Act, which is a real kind of euphemism for a law that makes it extremely difficult for unions to survive. And it does so by attacking this kind of bureaucratic mechanism by which they're able to get dues from their dues-paying members. And so it's a way to really weaken the labor movement in Florida. And again, we can see how Don't Say Gay really actually helps you pass something like the Paycheck Protection Act. And that is, if you tell all of the voters that we need to reform the curriculum because there are all of these, in the kind of DeSantis agenda's terms, grooming school teachers and adults throughout the public education sector, then we need to kind of take them down a peg. We need to kind of come at them in their most powerful form, which would be their teachers' unions. And so again, it kind of, at the very least, it makes it harder to defend the teachers in those scenarios. And we can see this stated extremely kind of straightforwardly by Christopher Rufo, who is kind of famous for coining a few different kind of conservative kind of terms of attack. Critical race theory bans were kind of the idea of Christopher Rufo. And he's behind Don't Say Gay and things like that as well. And his own kind of stated plan for public education was to foment, in his terms, universal public school distrust. And the idea is if you can create distrust in the public sector, like in the education realm, then you can make it much easier to go after the teachers' unions. You can make it much easier to defund and to rechannel the funding to public schools into the coffers of religious and otherwise private education kind of institutions, which is something that we see in Florida and really across the country. But thankfully, we see unions like the National Education Association in Florida take this really head on. Last year, they devised a plan to combat both assaults on queer workers and their kind of fundamental existence as a union in that state. So I want to turn to corporate America for a little bit here. And I want to say a few things up front. One, it's actually true that many US corporations have done some things for queer people, sometimes before even some unions extended similar benefits. So that is, many US corporations have offered inclusive benefits and protections to queer, importantly, white-collar workers for the last few decades. And we've also seen businesses pressure governments to expand civil rights laws. So, for example, 125 major US companies organized as the Business Coalition for Workplace Fairness, and they advocated for national civil rights legislation over 2 decades ago. And occasionally, those corporations have even threatened to withhold investments from cities and states that oppose LGBTQ rights. But if we look kind of at some specific examples, we can see actually how thin that commitment to queer rights in a broader sense really is. And one place we can look is North Carolina. And so way back in 2016, North Carolina really kind of pioneered something that we call a bathroom ban law. And so they wanted to be the first state to ban trans people from using the restroom or locker room facilities that best matches their gender identity. And kind of astoundingly, in 2016, North Carolina passed this law. Governor Pat McCrory signed it into law, and there was significant blowback from corporate America. And that is, you saw companies like PayPal, for instance, and a few others, even take their new headquarter plans out of the state of North Carolina. And they said it was because they were protesting North Carolina's bathroom ban and that their workers wouldn't find it a kind of hospitable place to live. And I think that's partially true. I think that these corporations wanted to make sure that they could recruit the kind of best talents, or so they thought, for their white-collar workplaces. Again, that's not going to employ very many people in the grand scheme of things. But it's also kind of even more perversely something that just had to do with tax benefits. And that is, many of these corporations that pulled out of North Carolina in 2016 and kind of said, we're taking the high road, they went over to a state next door, for instance, and they used their leverage to get a better deal with that state. And what these deals often look like are tax abatements. They're kind of deals that say that if you come build your headquarters in my state, you're not going to have to pay taxes on your new property for 10 years or something like that. And so they were able, again, to kind of play these states off one another in this race to the bottom way. And then the states that they then went to, number one, were kind of red states with not very robust worker protections. But they were also states that were going to lose the valuable tax dollars from those corporations that would fund things like public education. So there's something really kind of perverse going on in a lot of this kind of corporate action on queer and trans rights. But you might be thinking that in the last few years, we don't even see things like that happen. So since 2021, we've seen anti-LGBTQ bills, and particularly anti-trans laws, just kind of take off across the United States. Now, most red states, that is, that have kind of strong Republican Party majorities in government, have banned, for instance, gender-affirming care for minors. And so why haven't corporations made the same sort of stand this time? Well, for one, if they were so keen to kind of play states off one another, that's a bit harder to do now if you're kind of moving to Tennessee, and if you want to kind of protest and say, oh, actually, I'm going to pull out my headquarters from your state and go to a state like Georgia, for instance, well, they have a gender-affirming care ban too. So it's not going to like help you make that sort of deal with another state that's more suitable. And you're probably not going to go to a state like New York or California very readily, where they have stronger labor protections in the first place. And so again, this makes it kind of more difficult for these corporations to get something that's worth it for them to not relocate in these states. But then we also see that we can see one example of that, this company Oracle Software, which is a huge kind of formerly Silicon Valley kind of tech company, they, a few years ago in 2021, were planning a new Nashville headquarters. And then they had been kind of a vocal kind of pro-trans corporation. And when put to task with why they were moving their headquarters to Nashville, Tennessee, as Tennessee was passing that year, not 1, 2, 3, but 4 bills into law attacking queer people, Oracle's spokespersons said that, well, we're going to bring queer inclusivity with us to our new headquarters in Nashville. And so that is, they kind of made the argument that actually we're still doing the right thing because the few white-collar workers who are going to work at this new headquarters will have our own internal protections. But again, that's not doing it much for the kind of broader population of Tennessee that's being subject to these laws. And then lastly, on this kind of front, we see Starbucks last year attempt to divide workers by using a sort of corporate diversity politics, in that they kind of made these statements that said, well, if Starbucks Workers United organizes our shops, maybe we won't be able to provide such great gender-affirming care benefits as part of our employee health insurance plans any longer. And so there you can see this kind of an attempt to pit the union against trans rights advocates, against trans employees in the workplace who are probably really kind of banking on having those sorts of coverage for what can be extraordinarily expensive gender-affirming care treatments. And that's what the boss does best time after time. It goes back to struggles in desegregating workplaces in the United States. We see that the boss kind of divides workers along these lines and makes it more difficult to kind of generate solidarity, especially when they're feeling very kind of threatened by labor militancy. So how are queer workers and consumers supposed to combat corporate America's mostly disingenuous commitment to queer rights and health? Well, for instance, boycotts are a very common tactic. We see them throughout history, but they have some real limits that I want to talk about. And that is, we often celebrate this very early moment of queer worker solidarity that was the Corps' boycott. And I think there's something to celebrate there, and I think there's also a cautionary tale that we should tell about the Corps' boycott as well. So in 1974, we had this Teamsters leader, Alan Baird, and he led Northern Californian unionized beer distributors in a struggle against Corps' management. And Corps was refusing to expand contract benefits to those Teamster workers. Now, sensing a possible collaboration, Baird very kind of cleverly brought Bay Area gay activists into the union's boycott activities of Corps, and he did so by highlighting Corps' very right-wing advocacy. And that is, Joseph Corrs actually provided seed money to the Heritage Foundation, which is a religious right era organization that combines an attack on labor rights, government, and queer people. They do so all through today. And so Baird said, look at what Joseph Corrs is funding, and then also look at the discriminatory workplace practices that the Corps company imposes on its workers, which were more draconian than the even terrible policies that many companies had at that time. And so this collaboration that Baird formed proved to be very symbiotic. That is, the boycott created relationships that spurred unions to implement anti-discrimination contract protections. And it persuaded gay rights activists to organize against anti-labor ballot measures. So there was a lot of good that came out of this collaboration. But even just a few years into this alliance building project, it became clear that queer advocates could be wooed just as easily by corporate allies. And that is, when Corrs realized the threat that displeased gay customers posed to the company's bottom line, that is, when Corrs was being pulled out of the taps of gay bars across California, queer people were refusing to buy it to keep it in their home, Corrs has seen this and they're quickly pivoting. And they quickly added sexual orientation protections to the company-wide anti-discrimination policy in 1978. And they also, in the 1980s, were at the forefront of kind of corporate donations to AIDS charities. By the end of the 1990s, Corrs had implemented things like domestic partner benefits. They contributed large donations to queer liberal nonprofits. They had hired gay liaisons, including future Vice President Dick Cheney's daughter, Mary Cheney, to launder its image. And to the Teamsters' dismay, Coors once again was flowing from queer bars' beer taps. We can see in these kind of gaudy advertisements here. And ironically, then, what made the Coors boycott so successful, that is the fact that a company's policies toward queer people could mobilize consumers to action, is fundamentally what broke it apart. And so I also want to think about ways that we can think strategically about how unions today might fight in kind of not conceiving LGBTQ issues as those particular to a small fraction of consumers or workers, and to think creatively about organized labor's capacity for promoting equal treatment as well as kind of general welfare and public goods. So that is, in some instances, union advocacy for public goods spending could actually benefit many trans people even more than trans-specific reforms might. And that might sound kind of contradictory. So take, for example, public transit and sex markers in Philadelphia. From 1981 until 2013, SEPTA, which is the kind of, it's called the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority. They run all the buses and subways in Philadelphia. SEPTA had these monthly transit passes that were marked with a male or female sticker. And that caused a lot of problems for trans women, like this one Philadelphia-based trans rights advocate, Charlene Arcilla. And that is whether Arcilla presented an M-stamped or an F-stamped pass, she was actually turned away by bus drivers who were tasked with interpreting her sex. Importantly, SEPTA's motivation for implementing sex markers actually had nothing to do with trans-identified riders. The sex designations didn't even have anything to do with policing the sex binary as a sort of norm of society. But instead, they were an anti-fraud measure, and they were designed to prevent revenue loss by stopping married, cis men and women from sharing passes. And they really couldn't afford to take that sort of hit from this kind of commonplace fraud. And so we could see for decades, SEPTA workers who are organized in the Transport Workers Union, they've rallied for increased transit spending and against efforts to privatize transit lines. And so additional funding, if the union could have more kind of support in government to continue to put on that fight, they could kind of change the conditions by which SEPTA is operating on such a thin kind of budget margins that they feel this pressure to squeeze every last cent out of their riders with things like anti-fraud sex markers on your monthly transit pass. But instead of additional funding, however, a trans-specific reform was actually implemented, but it actually did less for many trans Philadelphians than a public goods approach might have done. And that is, SEPTA in 2013 moved to scrap its sex markers, but it was disconnected from any investment in the infrastructure, as evinced by the system's current financial crisis. So trans riders are no longer subject to humiliating onboarding experiences, but all riders, trans and cis alike, are now suffering under the collapse of the poorest big city in America's public transit system. So I want to conclude here by talking a bit about the uphill battle that workers in the US, and that is queer and straight, kind of face today. And so for all its exciting youth and queer labor militancy, Starbucks Workers United has faced some considerable constraints before the National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB, in the last few years. We've seen the NLRB under Biden administration General Counsel Jennifer Abruzzo is a powerful pro-labor force. So that's not the problem. Actually, Abruzzo is lauded by labor advocates as perhaps one of the kind of most pro-labor general counsels to ever head the NLRB. But Congress has left Abruzzo and the broader NLRB extremely underfunded and unstaffed, meaning that it's hard to effectively punish bad behavior by corporations like your Starbuckses. It's not impossible, though, And that can be seen by the NLRB's decision earlier this year to force CEO Howard Schultz to apologize for offering new benefits to non-union stores only. And so the NLRB, in that instance and others, has at least been able to slap the wrist of Starbucks as it has attempted to repeatedly break labor law in order to prevent Starbucks Workers United from kind of gaining a labor stronghold in their corporation. We also see the NLRB also faces an existential threat from lawsuits brought by companies like Elon Musk's SpaceX, Amazon, and Trader Joe's. And here, these corporations have attempted to use the Supreme Court's conservative supermajority. Again, it's a 6-3 conservative supermajority on the court right now. And they've attempted to use that supermajority to rule the entire National Labor Relations Board as unconstitutional. It is that dramatic. They say the entire thing is unconstitutional. And that is, they're making these arguments by taking broad anti-bureaucracy arguments or broad anti-administrative state arguments. And we can talk about those in detail if anyone is interested. They get kind of legally esoteric. There are arguments that Amazon has made that the folks who are kind of the board members of the NLRB are unconstitutionally sitting in those seats because current law does not allow them to be removed for any reason by the president. So there's a fight over what the president's powers are per Article 2 of the Constitution there. We also see arguments that the NLRB violates Amazon's due process rights as well as its rights to a jury trial. And that goes to the core of having an agency decide labor capital disputes, because Amazon is saying we should just throw this into the judiciary, which would be a much worse venue for workers to try to organize on. So many of these arguments are made effectively in other cases that have hampered the power of the Security Exchange Commission and the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate financial and fossil fuel companies respectively. So they're the same arguments, even sometimes the same attorneys and corporations that are attempting to gut sort of financial, environmental, and worker agencies in the federal government. We see Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 for a future Trump administration would likely lead to the total destruction of the NLRB, or at least a few major hits against its ability to secure these fair elections and workplaces for unionizing and unionized employees. And so that is a somewhat sober note to end on, but it's an important one, I think, as we head into the national elections next month. It's a reminder that there's no spark from queer workers or young workers or any other demographic of workers, as exciting and as necessary and vitalizing as labor militancy today might be. But there's no spark, there's no single kind of fix that's going to remedy the decades-long destruction of workers' rights and these bureaucratic agencies, imperfect as they are, that were won by labor militants in the 1930s by pressuring the Democratic presidential administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who gave us the NLRB, and continue to give workers then of all backgrounds the greatest chance of exercising their power in the workplace and beyond. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Before we transition into Q&A, how about another round of digital applause for our guest tonight? That was absolutely fantastic. Yeah, and I agree. Kind of a sobering note to end on. Like I said, this is, these are confusing and frustrating times, but, historically, those are also the moments that lead to the kind of like radicalization and organization that, that leads to real change, which is kind of exactly what I think, the end of your presentation has laid the prescription. It's like things need to change fairly dramatically, fairly quickly. But I think, I mean, the work is amazing. The history here is really fascinating. I think the way you sort of like contextualize, the sort of the material strategies behind this, the scapegoating and the division of American workers over time, and this like, the real organizing and coalition building that's occurring between capital and between, cultural apparatuses like the religious right, and that kind of like, you know, symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationship that has existed for, decades at this point. Looking at, somebody mentioned in the comments, that what was happening in the 70s in California sounds a lot like what's happening in Florida. And it's a page out of the same playbook, but it's also like the playbook's only one page long, right? It's like the same sort of rhetorical gesture, over and over again. But I think, this idea that, in order to sort of press back against that organizing and coalition building, that's being pressed upon workers, like we need to do, we need to answer with the same. But these are, really perilous times, and I think, I can't help but, you know, I mean, I'm aware of what's going on with the NLRB and the way that the goalposts are sort of moving, even as more workplaces file for certification. The NLRB is underfunded, like they can't keep up with these petitions, and it seems like those creeping anti-democratic tendencies. That's what I said. Like the hypocrisy of claiming that the NLRB is unconstitutional because those people can't be removed, but isn't that like exactly what the Supreme Court is, right? Yeah, it's kind of it's pretty rich. We've got a ton of questions. I'm noticing as I'm like monologuing here, we've got questions coming into the chat board, so we could cycle through those. But I tell you what, actually, why don't while I look at those, do you mind? I had a couple questions from students come in about just kind of like your background, how you arrived at this particular phase of your career, because I know you've kind of pivoted from your earlier work. So people were interested, and I think students are always interested in just like, how did the person I just heard from go from being a student like me to an expert who's now teaching this stuff.
Definitely. So just talk a little bit about that kind of development.
Sure, I think everybody loves an origin story, right?
I can give an origin story, which is very suiting because, as you heard earlier, I published a book last year called Born This Way, and it was on the sort of development of a bioessentialist or kind of story rooted in the biological origins of what it means to have a gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender identity. And so I was really curious about how that became this sort of kind of very popular, very politically salient idea. And I kind of did a history of the scientific and legal and political moves that sort of made that happen and made that a common refrain among national LGBTQ organizations. And Lady Gaga, for instance, it became a cultural kind of refrain as well. And so I was very interested, and I still am very interested in the sort of politics of science and how science and politics co-constructs ideas about sexuality and gender. And I still do a lot of that work. But the book also had this sort of political economic undergirding to it. And that is, I was really interested in Born This Way, primarily because I saw it as the sort of idea that organizes a very particular form of LGBTQ politics. And as a particular form of LGBTQ politics that I don't think is represented in the labor movement, which fights for a whole host of things and is not just so centric on kind of one identity or axis of identity. But instead, in this realm, we see national organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, like the National LGBTQ Task Force, and even the ACLU. They have these sorts of narratives about Born This Way that sell a very narrow version of victory, essentially. And that is, if we can win things like civil rights, that's going to benefit anyone who is LGBTQ. And that is, we all have a sort of shared fate. And even more deeper, we have a shared biological fate. We're all kind of one of the same. And we have interests that flow from that. But there's so many problems with that, and I'm not the first one to point these out, but that the Born This Way narrative kind of says that there's something fundamentally connecting the interests of a millionaire. I hope she's just a millionaire. I don't think she's a billionaire. Caitlyn Jenner, this wealthy trans woman, with your average kind of trans worker who works at Starbucks, and a civil rights law protection that will allow, for instance, Caitlyn Jenner to buy any property that she wants to without being discriminated against for her gender identity. Well, if you're working at Starbucks, especially if you're working at Starbucks in a major American city, you're not thinking about, am I going to be discriminated against in the mortgage lending process? You're thinking about, can I make rent? And anti-discrimination law has nothing to say for you. And so again, the kind of born this way idea is this sort of political narrative that I think coheres that very kind of deceptive idea that queer people's interests are fundamentally aligned with one another. And I think that's not the case in an extremely heterogeneous group, most of whom are poor and working class, like any group that we could draw boundaries around. So I was always very interested in that. And I've moved more into thinking about why corporations fund all sorts of attacks on sexuality and gender minority rights today, based somewhat on the premise that Charles Koch, for instance, who gives a ton of money, this oil tycoon, gives a ton of money to anti-queer groups, but he doesn't hate queer people. He doesn't care about queer people. He's a strict kind of libertarian, which really, I should say, libertarians don't exist. Everyone wants the government to do something for it and not other things. So Koch wants the government to help secure his sorts of power in the oil chemical realms that he works in, and to also destroy any regulatory kind of apparatus that exists to challenge that control over resources and workers. And so by doing things like funding groups that make, don't say gay in Florida very kind of a popular right-wing refrain, is distracting, and also, as we talked about, justifies an attack on labor, for instance. And so in general, that's kind of where I have been training a lot of my focus these days, is all the sorts of ways that corporations have sort of thin commitments to diversity politics, or are fundamentally using them for very kind of capitalist class agendas.
There's one from Enrica who, I don't know if, let's see, this one kind of looks ahead here. So within the article, some of the barriers mentioned about the success of trans union activism is the lack of political supporting corporate organizing funding and generational anti-trans sentiments. How can we, this is sort of a practical question about how we can organize in our local communities in order to drum up more attention.
I mean, I think it is the question. I think it's the question. And I think one thing to do is to be very sober about the limits of certain forms of organization. And so I'm really not going to be the best person to talk to about really on-the-ground tactics. There are going to be folks who are kind of expert practitioners and of that sort of thing. But I will say that there are certain organizations that we should understand by their class character will be poor allies in these sorts of fights if we're thinking about the fight for not just trans rights, but for trans workers' rights, or workers' rights more broadly. And that is, I mean, we saw the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, make some extremely anti-NLRB arguments in court a few weeks ago. Matt Brunig has a great article about it, published in Jacobin. And that's because fundamentally these groups have a sort of commitment to fighting for various versions of civil rights, and some of them are very kind of crucial civil rights to have. I personally benefit from many of the work that the ACLU has done. But at the end of the day, they're not going to be allies in the broader fight for kind of worker struggles against these kind of corporate efforts to totally get rid of the NLRB. So again, just being really sober about what kind of organizations will have the capacity to do what you want them to do, and to not think that that they're persuadable or something like that. I mean, fundamentally, their donations come from wealthy donors and corporations. When I went to that LGBTQ task force conference that I mentioned at the start of my talk, the first thing that you see when you enter the exhibit hall is a a giant Gilead booth selling pharmaceuticals. And they're crucial life-saving pharmaceuticals, but it's a pharmaceutical company that is at like the core. And Coca-Cola's name was all over the pamphlet. I mean, these are not friends of the of the labor movement. And just being kind of, again, really sober about that, I think, is at least the first step.
That is a great point. We've got Meg who has a question and has agreed to go on mic here. Meg, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi there. Also share my video for a face. So Meg Skian, I use they, them pronouns. So I'm actually a union organizer at the REI Tacoma. So come say hi to me sometime. So we're actually seeing REI has hired the same law firm that has represented Amazon and Starbucks to literally union bust. And so in May, when we hadn't even really like talked about holding an election, suddenly our managers were swooping in, being like, there are union organizers and they're being really sneaky and they're trying to hide things from you. And they did this entire anti-union run campaign in our store. And the thing is like, we know that's not our managers, that's not their beliefs, that's corporate's belief. And they're spending millions of dollars fighting unions while also saying that they're bleeding money in like, overall profit, but they refuse to negotiate contracts in good faith with the stores that have unionized. And I'm part of a national discord of stores that are trying to unionize or are unionized. So I'm also part of an effort in with Tacoma for All and the Democratic Socialists of America and UFCW. We're working on a 2025 ballot measure called the Workers' Bill of Rights that's trying to roll out some kind of union-friendly actions at a city and county level. But my question really is, how do we emphasize that workers are more vulnerable under right to work and without unions? And especially like thinking that we'll have these corporations saying, oh, well, a union contract will get rid of your benefits that exist. But the reality is we could lose our benefits today without any sort of like ability to push back. And do you see a possibility that unionizing could be seen as less radical in this generation?
Yeah, wow. Well, first I want to say I'm so grateful that you're involved in these campaigns. It's great to learn about them. It's inspiring. And I mean, I think everything that you say, I just totally agree with. I think that the idea that the union is going to make it so you can't secure these sorts of rights and benefits that you've come to appreciate on the job. Well, like you said, we have to get the message out there that you know, Corey Robin, I think, said this once that the Pharaoh was good to Joseph for a while, and that is the boss can be good for your existence, but then if the boss changes, or if the boss changes their mind, even, well, then you're just as vulnerable, or even more vulnerable than you were before. So I think you're totally right. I think emphasizing the idea that the baseline is not guaranteed because you don't have democratic power in your workplace without a union. I mean, I just totally agree with that. And I think what you're saying about REI is one of these things that it points to the idea that a mentor of mine would say that liberals always look for the good corporation. They're always holding out that one of them exists. And I think REI is giving us a sort of another great example of the fact that there's a structural thing about these companies that makes them want to avoid having unionized workforces. And you said they're definitely playing that card. I totally believe it. I totally believe it. They say that we're a family. We have these sorts of values that we uphold, and we want to make sure we can continue them. But yeah, those values are never a democracy in the workplace, are they?
I remember the sort of the opening salvo of their anti-union drive was a video that opened with a land acknowledgement. It was just like, I mean, like their willingness to sort of cloak themselves in, the cosmetics of progressive politics is particularly, pretty offensive.
Mm.
Excellent. Well, thanks for sharing that, Meg. And yes, we should talk at some point. How about Diana? I saw you had a hand up.
Hi, I loved reading your article or piece. It was great. I did notice that religious conservative right politics continuing to dismantle the power of progressive unions throughout the years is way more concerning than like I feel like it has been ever in my life. The more I read about workers' rights and civil rights pertaining to gender identification, the more I begin to realize the current Supreme Court methodology or understanding of the Constitution and Bill of Rights seems to rank them in order in which the first are more important than the ones thereafter, like freedom of religion, in this case, Christianity surpasses treating people indiscriminately, freedom of speech surpasses others, etc. Due to the nature of the Supreme Court, do you see corporate activism in support of unions the only path to combat conservative labor and consumer politics?
Oh, thank you. And so, yeah, I'm just going to repeat it so I make sure I understand it that that corporations have the most power to achieve even a modicum of rights given the way the Supreme Court is structured. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty much. I feel like how you had mentioned, like when corporates pull out or pull back, you see more things getting done. I guess like that's the realm that I'm in. Like I see more happening
Mm.
there than actual movement on the ground type deal, or like more reaction there versus more reaction to people actually organizing.
I see, I see. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, for one, the corporations are extremely vocal about it because part of the point is demonstrating that they care because it's part of a PR campaign. If you read, um, I've subjected myself before to these things. If you read the Harvard Business Review, for instance, or the Deloitte Review, these are like big industry magazines that tell you how to be a more efficient boss. And one of the things that they've been telling folks for about a decade now, maybe even longer, but at least a decade, they've been telling corporate leaders, you got to attract you have to attract queer white collar employees. And why? Because they're going to help us market to the queer demographic. And so there's a lot of emphasis on that. And so portraying oneself as being an advocate of queer rights, even if you have a thin commitment, even if your commitment is just changing the logo of your app to rainbow hued during the month of June for Pride Month, that's enough to kind of signal for some folks that at least, understandably, it's a safe place to work. And that's how they can attract that sort of white collar talent. So they've got that kind of incentive to be very vocal about it. But even these corporations, I will say, have shocked me in how much they have rolled back on their sorts of displays of Pride Month support, for instance. So actually, last June was probably the first time that I felt this kind of eerie absence of the thing that I'd grown to really hate. And I was, to your point, I was disturbed because I had thought, well, at least that's a bulwark for trans rights, for queer rights. And again, look how easily that goes away when it becomes a kind of threat rather than a benefit to the bottom line. So I think again, these corporations are really loud and sometimes they do push for consequential things. M many Fortune 500 CEOs uh, told the Supreme Court in 2020 in that case, Bostock v. Clayton County that I mentioned, they said you need to provide Title VII employee anti-discrimination rights to these workers. And why? It's because it helps us retain them if they don't feel like they can lose their jobs for this one kind of reason. Um, and so they might have somewhat of an effect. And I wouldn't deny that, but it's a very kind of weak one.
Thank you.
Great question. I think we've got time for maybe a couple more questions. And I see Kiana, you've had your hand up for a little while.
I first wanted to start off with my name is Kiana Jones, and I go by she, her pronouns. I was very fascinated by your article as I felt like it was very informative, and I just wanted to keep reading more and more. I just wanted to know more as far as a political stance. It looks like Starbucks has a new CEO, which is, or who is Brian Nicole, who has been in the position just recently, September of 2024. What are your thoughts around positively regarding the history of LGBTQ rights? How do you feel about that? And do you feel like that plays a role in anything?
Sorry, that the role of this change at Starbucks is going to create?
Yeah,
Or
with having a new CEO, and just kind of being on board with the union.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know very much about the new CEO of Starbucks. I do think that the company in general has felt a lot of pressure from the NLRB, public pressure from the union itself to engage in at least some dialogue with the union, with Starbucks Workers United. But I think that they would probably be the first to tell you that it's still kind of an uphill, and you know, I would suspect that the new leadership at Starbucks is going to be motivated by the same things, which is to retain as much control as they have in who they hire, what the protocols are at work, what kind of rights that you have in general in the workplace. So I don't see it as a terrible source of optimism in the struggle to gain union recognition. And I do think, I'll say, like, more broadly, I think there's something really perverse going on right now where many corporations in the United States are uneasy about a second Donald Trump presidency. And they're uneasy for a variety of reasons. You know, he's erratic even when he helps them get what they want. They think that they can get a lot of what they want under the Democratic Party. That's been the case for decades and decades and decades in this country, as both parties have shifted to the right. But just like last time, I think we'll see a lot of corporations make considerable peace with the Trump administration if they make good on appointing folks to the NLRB that are going to kind of crush its power. And I think that I tend not to predict a lot of things in politics anymore, especially since 2016. But I think that's a close to a safe bet that would be the outcome.
Thank you.
I feel like within corporations too, that's like this cultural fascination we have with CEOs as sort of avatars of the corporation. You know, sometimes changes up top are, you know, the most cosmetic change an organization can make. You know, like everything below that person remains exactly the same, but you know, they're introduced as a change agent who's going to shake things up. And it's like, at the end of the day, you know, they're still selling coffee and exploiting workers, right? All right, we've got time for two more here. How about, and we got two hands up. So Lewis, you have a question.
Yes. I was actually just piggybacking off Leanna's question of sorry, hold on, give me a moment. Of the Supreme Court. I was reading about the Supreme Court rulings and senators pushing against the LGBTQ community. I was actually wondering, it's like, how would unions be able to prepare and like respond to potential rulings on labor and the LGBTQ rights that could like affect both of them?
Yeah, it's again, like so many of these questions, they're kind of like the most dire questions that we start to really entertain answers to at this period. I will say that you know, unions I've been involved with in the post-Janus era, and that is when the public sector became effectively right to work, have shifted a lot of, you know, their strategy in terms of you just have to retain and keep a lot of focus on making sure that people are signing their membership cards, and you have to be more up to date on that kind of knocking on doors as a kind of regular practice of union work, and that it's kind of maintaining your membership when workers are not incentivized to pay those sorts of dues that allow the union to have the strength and numbers that it really needs. So there's some really kind of tactical ways that unions can prepare themselves for massive changes like they did in the years leading up to the Janus decision. I think I'm struggling not to end on another very sober note, but I think I don't know. I think it'll be a lot harder to prepare for the kind of dismantling of the NLRB. I mean, that has been the structure by which workers unionize for rights in a sort of fair, neutral, agency arbitrated sort of process, and it protects the boss from doing sorts of things that are deemed to be unfair and violations of labor law when you're trying to organize a union. So you can't threaten people that you're going to fire them. It's a violation of labor law when the NLRB is kind of in existence and running your election. But so one thing to think about is going to be, if it really gets that bad, is to think about the history of labor organizing before we had the NLRB. And it was harder and there's more protracted struggles, but labor unions in this country predate. Many labor unions in this country, predate the NLRB. And so there's something probably to be learned from that sort of history of struggle and other ways that unions have kind of formed when they didn't have the sorts of benefits of that neutral arbiter.
I really like that question, Lois. I'm glad that's one you asked, because I was thinking during your presentation about how many of these stories in labor history are, kind of fundamentally reactive. And it's like, I want to hear more proactive stories. And I feel like with this looming NLRB, catastrophe, it's like now it's, instead of what are we going to do when that happens, like what can we do before it happens to not only prepare ourselves, but to prevent that from happening. But yeah, it's gonna require some deep organizing and some mobilizing. All right, we've got one final question.
Can I just say something on that front, Alex?
Sure.
I just want to plug, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if students already read Jane McAlevey in your class, but Jane McAlevey's work on the sort of nuts and bolts of organizing is really kind of invaluable and hard to put down in terms of just a text and how engaging her writing is itself. So yeah, Jane McAlevey's work on how you build union power is going to be kind of, I think should be in everyone's back pockets for the foreseeable future.
Excellent. Yeah, without a doubt. Cayman, would you care to pose the final question?
Hi, my name is Cayman, he, him pronouns. I was wondering how unions can help to ensure that LGBTQ rights are not just treated as some sort of afterthought in corporate policies, like, oh yeah, we're gonna incorporate these we're gonna incorporate these LGBTQ rights, but in reality they just put it like at the bottom of their folder or something. So is there anything that like either the unions or the people themselves can do to like make sure like, no, we need this to be a priority?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. And I think it kind of comes down to the question of like the broad question of like how you build solidarity, like how you account for the sorts of things that your contract, that your union needs to have at the forefront in order to make sure that all the workers, have the things they need to live their kind of daily lives in and outside of the workplace, right? And so I think really heartening development is that some of that's really happened in the labor movement in the last decade or so, in the last few decades when we think about gay and lesbian rights, but even in the last decades for trans rights. And that is just as sort of other kind of racial and gender-based civil right, or rather rights protections, anti-discrimination protections have become kind of standard for a lot of unions. I think that we're seeing those sorts of protections really being extended to queer workers as well. So I think that's a really positive development on this front. I think when we think about the corporations, I think like I think it's very difficult to keep them to keep their word on anything. And the best thing to do is to just have the worker power in order to make them do what you want them to do. I mean, that's how you keep things to be a priority. And I think that's the only way that you're going to make them a priority. But thankfully, it's possible.
Excellent. I feel like that's a good note to end on, right? Well, thank you so much. I feel like I did not mention, well, I mentioned Stony Brook, but I don't know that everybody on this call knows that that is in New York State, which is on the eastern coast, which means it is almost 10:30 o'clock at night where Joanna is. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for staying up so late and hanging out. This has been absolutely fantastic. I learned a ton and just cannot wait to dive into more of your work. And I'm excited to see the next thing. So, yeah, one last round of applause, our hearts, our thumbs up.